Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Advocacy TV. It's actually TV, or it could be a podcast, or it could be a really cool little mini novel you're reading. I'm Scott Seaman, Executive Director here at Advocacy, and I'm pleased to have your Government Relations and Advocacy Director, Roz Thompson, joining me today.
Happy to be here to talk about all things advocacy. So yeah, I'm glad we're doing this.
Yeah, so let's jump in, Roz. This is going to be sloppy and messy because, like most things, we didn't rehearse this at all.
No, and it's complicated.
So,
yeah.
We feel like it's super important to give people an update on our advocacy efforts this year. But before we get to where we are today, what I'd love to do is climb back into history. So, you and I have been doing this for a little bit.
Sure.
And if you were to describe, because I know you've captured this on paper, if you look back through the last 15 years of education reform, how would you describe some of the changes you've seen in the system?
So I guess the biggest overarching, theme that I see is that there's such an incredible focus on instruction, right? We want our leaders in our buildings to focus on being the lead learner of instruction. And so a lot of the reform efforts that we see that I've collected on documents that really help portray the, culmination of lots of different policy maneuvers and things like that speak to instruction. In terms of assessments, graduation requirements, standards, evaluation procedures for teachers and principals. So much of it is focused on instruction, content that we want to make sure we cover for students and things like that. In conjunction with that, you've got this increase of mental health supports and needs that students have. So we're trying to not only help students navigate being adolescents and teenagers and little people, but we're trying to also focus on their learning and manage a building. So we've added, titles to the role of principal, essentially.
Yeah, I was thinking about it the other day. I mean, I was a high school principal 15 years ago, and how the job has drastically changed in just those 15 years. And you hit it on the head perfectly as far as the emphasis on being an instructional leader. But yet nothing's come off the plate of all the things that I was doing back then as the manager of really what's kind of daily chaos.
Right.
And then I also think about all the other things that we've thrown in society that all come through the front doors of a school.
Yep.
Social media, parental pressures,
Yep.
Political rifts in our societies and our communities, all of that's coming into the schoolhouse. And it's all kind of landed on?
The plate of the principal.
The lap of the plate of a principal.
Yeah, and I don't think, you and I have heard it from our members, even the last 2 or 3 years dealing with the pandemic, we haven't been in the building during that time, but they tell us, things have changed in the last 2 or 3 years. And so we can only relay those stories and try to understand the shoes they're walking in, but even in the last 2 or 3 years, changes have happened to our societies and communities and schools.
Yeah, one was just describing it the other day. Principaling post-COVID is even different than it was prior to.
Right. So last 10 years and 15 years is one thing, but last 2 or 3 years has also compounded changes.
So I'm starting my 10th year here at AWSP, and I would say even my work has changed in the last few years because the phone calls are changing. The calls coming into the system here at the association that's designed to support principals, the principalship, and each and every student, that's our mission, by the way, has changed.
Yeah.
By the sheer volume of calls coming in of principals in distress. We're seeing more principals put out on admin leave, more principals accused of things that trigger an investigation and admin leave. More principals put on plan of improvements, just grievance, just lots of employment-related things happening to principals, which is making the job tough, on top of all those things that you just listed. The scary part for me is we're also seeing fewer and fewer teacher leaders expressing interest in the principalship.
Right. And in the 5 years that I've been here, as I've watched you and other associate directors handle those member support calls, when I came 5 years ago, it was, 50-ish, maybe a year, we'd get these calls of people in crisis, and now in the last year I was in the hundreds of people calling for those employment situations or crises.
Yeah,
and they need your support. We are the association that supports principals, and oftentimes it's we're the neutral ground for people in our state. They don't feel comfortable talking to people in their district. There isn't the capacity at OSPI to provide that. So here we are as people supporting 3,600 leaders in our schools.
So what this is leading to is this alarming number or trend or percentage of principal turnover. We are seeing fewer principals stay in the building long enough to lead the change. It's not uncommon now to be sitting in a room and have a principal say, yeah, I'm the 5th principal in 5 years. Or even worse, I'm the 5th principal in 4 years because there's so much change. And what we know about principaling is leadership takes time. And I know that you are tuned to research and what the Wallace Foundation has come out with, but what are some nuggets that jump to your mind when you think about what the Wallace Foundation, I mean, they've been studying principal leadership for the last 20 years, but they've had 2 big studies just recently that have highlighted the important role principals play.
Yeah, the 2 that I like to cite and think about often is just how long it takes to really, change the culture in a positive way, enact systems that affect kids and are good for kids. So that's, 3 to 5 to 7 to 10 years, right, depending on the situation. So it takes time to establish the culture systems learning that impacts students. The other, I think, more recent research with Wallace is that yes, teachers are incredibly #1 influence on kids, but now research is showing that principals and leading the learning in the building may actually be the #1 influence on student learning. And that's the most recent part that I think that was a culmination of some decades of research, but also numerous studies that pointed to that.
So when you compare these data points of how long it takes to shift the culture in a school and build those systems to support the culture and actually shift the narrative of learning for kids and adults. And then you lay that up next to the turnover rate in our state. To me, this is the biggest inequity in the system that we're not talking about.
Right.
Which is probably why we've landed on a lot of our advocacy efforts and a lot of the conversations we're leading with different agencies and organizations, not just here in Washington, but nationwide, as we really start to press into the fact that our kids deserve the best principal in the world.
Yep.
Every school.
Yeah, and our state has pressed into some really important pieces of legislation in the last few years around what students need, and equitable instruction, and each and every student, and inclusionary practices, and all means all. And how do we start pushing on systems to do that if people are fearful or concerned or worried or don't feel supported by the actions and moves that they're making as the leader?
Yeah, it's tough to step out and take a risk and change a bad for kids system when you potentially could be run out of the school or district or community for trying to lead those changes.
Right.
So it's not an easy fix.
No, it is not.
And it's not a one-size-fits-all fix.
Nope.
And you and I have done a lot of thinking on this, and so has our AWSP board. They've been great thought partners with us.
Yep.
You're so great with these visuals. You've kind of landed on these 3 lanes of advocacy. So if you were to describe our 3 lanes of advocacy, because it's not a simple fix.
Right.
It's multi-layered, multifaceted. Why don't you walk us through our 3 lanes? Yeah,
so this really came about, it kind of gelled for me last April, and I think it was once we were through the kind of bulk of the pandemic time frame that we met with our board in April and brainstormed and talked about, all of the challenges we've just talked about in our system. And I'm trying to categorize it. And so I, started making lists and taking their comments, and there are pieces of, so the 3 lanes really focus on the state level policy and what our legislature can or can't do, what our agency partners at the State Board of Education or OSPI or the Professional Educator Standards Board could do and rule, and then what our district partners can do or can't do with their policies that they're working on. So we try to take lots of the pieces of the feedback we were getting from our board and organize them into our 3 lanes. So what are the levers we might be able to pull in each lane that would help do a better job of supporting the leaders in our schools?
Yeah, because when you ask them what's something we could do, their eyes kind of glaze up because it's so enormous.
Yes.
Like they don't know where to start.
Yeah.
They don't know whether to tell you about how hard it is to manage student discipline Well, that might be a policy fix with OSPI. They might say to you, I have 34 cert evaluations that I'm supposed to do. Well, that might rest in TPEP.
Right, the rules.
In rules.
Or the law, yeah.
Some might say, you know, I've pressed too hard and now I'm getting grieved and I don't have any job protection, so I'm out.
Right.
Because I'm within my first 3 years of principaling, so I'm gone. And then locally, they might have their own context locally within their contracts or with the community that just makes principaling difficult and or rewarding, because we have to examine what's keeping people too as part of this process.
Yep.
So by way of example, Roz,
Sure.
we might have come out with a couple bills this year that have gathered the attention of people across the system.
Yep.
Senate Bill 5175
Yes.
and Senate Bill 5085.
Correct. Yep.
So why don't we break down those for
Okay,
people, just
let's
so they
do that.
kind of understand the rationale behind these and maybe what's transpired from just original conversations to now.
Yep.
So why don't we start with 5075 or 5175?
5175. Okay, so that bill, actually probably through conversations with legislators, in particular Senator Lisa Wellman, I'm sure that's the genesis of it, because she said to me in September, I want to write a bill about principal contracts. And that bill, she said, would allow a district, not require, but it would allow a district to provide a principal up to a 3-year contract. And I know in her thinking, she was shocked to learn that it's a year-to-year contract that our building leaders have. And I think from her CEO hat of knowing, you know, how to run companies, it feels like the responsibility and accountability of building leaders is worthy and deserving of more stability and more support in a contract. So she wrote the bill that would allow a district, doesn't require, but would allow them to provide up to a 3-year contract.
Yeah, so if I'm out there and I'm thinking I wouldn't mind taking a risk and jumping into a building that I know might be hungry or thirsty for leadership, if I knew I could go in there and have the protection to do the work for 3 years, I might be willing to take that risk.
Yep, and I see that also. I think that would be a way. It could be a tool a district uses to recruit somebody into a large high school. And what we're noticing about our internship data, for example, is that we don't have as many interns doing an internship at the high school level. We normally have about 200 interns every year, and about 60 of them usually work at the high school level, and this year we only have 20. So fewer people are choosing that. It's more complicated. There's more of a workload. We know around the state that some districts are having a hard time finding applicants for high school jobs. So it might be a tool that a district could use to say, hey, we need somebody, we want somebody in this really large school. Here are pieces of what your contract would look like, and we want to give you a 2-year contract or a 3-year contract to support you in your work of leading this building.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that 10, 15 years ago, a high school principal opening was a coveted position, and they would have 50, 60, 70, 80 applicants for a job like that. I've had more calls in the last 2 years from superintendents saying, hey, I've posted a high school principal position, and I didn't get any applicants.
Right.
Do you know anybody? We've seen districts post and then repost, and in the hopes of attracting somebody. So this could be actually something that might help a district actually get a highly qualified principal with experience to come.
Right, yep.
I know some of the pushback from superintendents is feeling like they're locking somebody into a 3-year contract. What would you say to that?
I would say, you know, and this was great advice from Senator Wellman, that, you know, you can write a contract so that there isn't, I think they're fearful of a large buyout or something they might have to, you know, do on these contracts. Write the contract in such a way that it wouldn't allow for that, or would only provide a 3-month severance package or something like that. So I think it's in how you write the contract that would be important. So.
Yeah, I actually fear, and I've been saying this for years, that one day, because the shortage is real, the districts might actually have to post like this package to get applicants. You can come here on a 3-year contract. This is going to be your salary. These are the benefits. I mean, these are some of the things they might have to list to get people to step into some of these jobs.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's that bill.
All right, let's jump over to the other one. That's
Yeah.
a little more complex.
It
Senate Bill
is-
5085.
It is more complicated. That's the one that we worked on this summer. We talked with our partners at OSPI. We shared some information from our board, and I think you spoke to earlier some of the situations in employment that were, maybe the common themes that we were hearing for some of our member support calls, and started looking at existing RCWs and how we could modify some of those to increase some supports. So there's 5 pieces to that bill initially, and through the process as it exists now, and today's the last day of January 2023, so a couple of those sections are gone. But I can walk through the 5 sections or talk about the existing pieces that we hope make it, because I think some of it is I think of it as low-hanging fruit that our system could tighten up. So one example is some making sure the evaluators of principals have some required training. Another piece is making sure that total years of experience in education count. So if I were a teacher for 10 years and an assistant principal for 5, that's 15 years, and that counts if I were to, move back to a teaching position or a counselor or do something different. The other piece is adding assistant principals into the language, where after 3 years, an assistant principal position is protected, and it's tied to their evaluation in terms of having to be moved to a subordinate position or not. We have incredible people, as you know, who choose to do the work of assistant principals, and we have to honor that as a system. So those are the 3 existing pieces. The other 2 parts of it related to having been on, in an investigation on an application, having that, not included is no longer there. And the piece about talking about contracts and saying, hey, let's talk about some of the working conditions that we want to talk about and making those contracts a little more robust. We've asked that section be taken out. And we'll work more with our partners to talk about what would be a really good model contract and what are the pieces that each district could or should include for their principals. Because we see contracts that are 1 page. They're the salary and the calendar year, and that's it. There's no other information for that principal around their contract language. But we also see some really robust contracts in our state. So we're trying to get to the point where across the board, our principals feel like lots of different areas of their job and their complicated profession are supported through a good contract.
Yeah, I think a principal really summarized this well for me one day, and he said, yes, my job's crazy. Yes, my job's overwhelming. I love my job, though. I love the kids, my school, my community. I don't worry about what's going to come at me every day. I think I can handle it. I'm not quoting him exactly.
Yeah.
He says, what I worry about is whether I have a job next year. And to me, that was alarming, because this is a super highly effective principal out there in the system.
Yep.
The other thing that had surprised me is that we do need great lifelong assistant principals. I mean, those leaders are with our kids that need relationships the most.
Right.
So to me, this seems like an easy way for the system to say, we see you, APs, we value APs, and we want you to stay where you're at if that's where you're comfortable being, because we need great lifelong assistant principals in the system.
They're much closer to the kids oftentimes, and some of them are very gifted at those systems of MTSS or the PBIS or the discipline or the, those pieces of attendance. How do we really encourage kids to be to school every day and on time? And they're closest to the kids and families, while the principal is more in the leadership role of all of the pieces of the systems of a school. So we love our APs.
We do.
We need more of them.
Which I guess takes me to the last part of this. It's like, where do we go from here? I've described this quite often as a principal leadership crisis, but the more I think about it, it's really a education crisis. We, whether we're teachers, assistant principals, and others in the system, we don't do a good enough job of saying to our own children, you should think about this as a profession.
Right.
So that has to change. So how are we speaking to our students in the system right now about becoming teachers?
Right.
How are we encouraging our teachers to step out and become, take that risk to become school administrators? What are we doing to address the conditions that some of these leaders are stepping into so they feel like they can take the risk?
Right.
What are we doing to encourage assistant principals who right now are quite often telling their principal, there's no way I'm doing your job. If you leave, I'm not applying for
Right.
it. So we have to fix that.
Right.
And then my hats off to our superintendents.
Yeah, for sure.
I used to say the high school principal job was probably the toughest in the system, and now I really believe the superintendents have the toughest job in the system. So to me, that's part of this leadership pathway.
Right.
What can we do to encourage people to see themselves as eventual superintendents and make their jobs realistic as well as we start to think about these pathways?
Right, and my latest story, one of them is, and I do have older children in their 20s, but I am not a grandmother, but I say, who's going to teach my grandchildren, right? At some point, when I have grandchildren, if I do, who's going to teach them? Because
we're actually going to announce that on the show today.
No, none of my
Oh,
children are
sorry.
pregnant,
Okay.
or not happening yet, for a long time, both of you, if you're watching. But, but so exactly to your point, how are we encouraging kids and making this like, oh, this is a very rewarding, meaningful career to go into education. There's great work around teacher residency prep and how we can provide more, hands-on and meaningful experiences for teachers who are learning the craft of teaching, because it's complex. And that can also be transferred to principals. How are we providing those really robust internship experiences so that those leaders feel prepared to step in and lead? And it really does follow, the overwhelming workload and accountability then that our district administrators and superintendents face. And you can see it in the last few years, especially through COVID, that our K-12 education system has not only, taken on learning, but we've taken on healthcare and feeding our children and families and all of these things that we care about in our communities. So we have to partner with larger, groups in our community, with the early learning sector, with the higher ed sector, with our healthcare partners. So to make all kids and families have a successful experience. And that will, mean that the people in our schools then are truly respected and cared about and are cheering on our kids to become future educators themselves.
Yeah, so the system needs to attract the next generation.
Right.
And I feel like there's a ton of urgency in this right now. I mean, we need to come together, all the alphabet soups in the system. I hope we're listening.
Yeah.
We need to come together immediately to figure out what we can do to attract. And there's the same urgency around how do we keep the ones that we have in all of these roles.
Right.
So I'm hoping that whether it's in the session or out of the session this year, the groups come together to start talking about the urgency around keeping our great people. So there's short-term, long-term.
Right.
When I think about those three big words that you and I keep using, attract, retain, and sustain our school leaders
Yep.
Across the whole board.
Right.
And you know me, I'm also kind of a big dreamer, though. Don't you
Yep,
think we should
yep,
maybe think about
yep.
redefining the roles?
Oh my gosh, that would be amazing. Yeah. I've heard you describe that, like the different roles of assistant principals.
Yeah,
Or
I mean, we mentioned earlier that 15 years ago, most principals were building managers.
managing.
And then they become instructional leaders and managers. Is it realistic now to say or expect for them to be both?
Right.
And maybe we need to
Right.
explore some different roles, which would involve our university partners, and
Exactly.
certification, and all
Right.
the others. So
Yep.
anyway, a lot of work.
A lot of work. It's very complex. Very complex. All the different levers that are out there to help make this profession manageable and sustainable and attractive.
So one of the things that we love about Roz is the relationships you have with our partners, our agency partners, other organizations. But if I'm a principal out there and I'm listening to some of this and it strikes a nerve or I have curiosity, you do a fantastic job of making it so that any principal or assistant principal can engage in advocacy work.
Yes.
So
Yes.
tell them a little bit about your Advocacy Council.
We have about 40-ish people around the state who really are committed and interested in this, and so we gather every Monday during the legislative session and have a Zoom and talk about the bills being heard that week. But more than that, at least throughout interim, it's maybe once a month we check in on some of the hot topics, and people around the state, they're in each of our ESDs. Are ones who are interested in talking about and spending more time on some of the issues, whether it's transitional kindergarten or dual credit or things like that. And so I'll try to organize different Zooms with legislators or agency partners doing some of that work. So you certainly, it's kind of a come one, come all. Would love to have lots of people on that council, and there's other ways you don't have to devote as much time. If we're doing action alerts or you want to partner with a legislator in your area, I'd be happy to make that connection for you so that you're just, emailing them or inviting them to your building when session's over, because they're pretty busy right now. But we have lots of new legislators out there that should, you're the expert. So you would be educating them as what is the role that you have as a principal, and what should they know about that.
So that is an all call.
Yeah.
To those of you out there watching or listening. Mm-hmm. If you want to help shape the future of education, please reach out to us. I never thought as a high school principal I could go back to Washington, D.C. and actually meet in offices with our elected officials to talk about the realities of principaling. And now I get the pleasure of watching our principals do, and assistant principals do that very thing. So if you want to get engaged with us at the state level, the national level, please reach out. My favorite thing to do is reach out to Roz.
Yes, do it. Email me. Be happy. Be great.
All right. Well, Roz, on behalf of all of our members and all the kids across the state in 295 districts and 9 ESDs, we can't thank you enough for all the work you do for principals. You are incredible.
Well, thank you for thanking me, but I am honored to do it on behalf of our members, because it's really their work that's tremendous. And there's a lot of respect for principals when I talk to legislators and all of our agency and government relation partners around the state. A lot of people working on these issues, and a tremendous amount of respect for principals and assistant principals.
Yeah, it's really actually kind of nice to go to these meetings with you.
Yeah.
And you and I don't have to really say anything anymore.
Yep.
People are speaking for us.
Yep, we're telling our stories, and we want you to tell your stories to us so we can keep relaying all of that. So thanks to our members.
Yeah, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of AWSP TV, AWSP Podcast, AWSP Blog, whatever format you read or see or listen to this in. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.